So, Don, it was so sad that Chris couldn't be with us this week, don't you think? But we'll just have to carry on.
We will wing it.
Oh,
well, you'll probably find someone who can better explain this super complicated study than I can.
Welcome once again to Free Associations from the Boston University School of Public Health, the Public Health and Medical Journal Club podcast for anyone who is as confused by the latest health study as I am by navigating international travel these days. Have you guys traveled internationally since COVID?
Nope.
I did my first trip, went to South Africa, and getting home was an exercise in paperwork. The number, you got to get a COVID test. It's got to be a certified, I had to do like the antigen test, videotaped or watched by somebody online. Then I had to get a public health record locator number in the UK.
This is in South Africa, coming back?
This was for the U.S., though.
So this is required by the U.S.?
Required by the U.S. Yeah, you have to have a PCR, like a certified PCR test, or you can do an antigen test, but then it has to be video monitored when you take it so that you can prove that it was really you and you didn't just swab your dog's nose or something like that.
My leopard.
Where do you get the test?
Binax. You order it online, and it comes with the link to connect to the service with a monitor.
Sent to your hotel in South Africa?
No, I took it with me. Oh. I bought it here.
Huh.
Yeah.
Wow.
And they're not cheap. $70 for two of them.
Wow. Ka-ching.
Yeah. So it was, it was not to the point where I couldn't navigate it all. It was just way more than I was expecting. So anyway, I am Matt Fox, the complainer-in-chief from the Department of Epidemiology and Global Health at the Boston University School of Public Health. Chris, you want to just introduce yourself because you seem to be good at just running with the dialogue.
Sure, I'll just follow suit. I'm Chris Gill from the Department of Global Health.
Well done. And Don Thea from the Department of what?
Global Health.
That's me.
Welcome, Don. Welcome,
trend.
Chris. Good
Not
to have
significant,
everyone.
though.
Good to have everyone back in the studio 2 weeks after the last time we were here. And Chris definitely didn't start to introduce the study this week.
Right. I wouldn't do that.
And as our usual reminder, head on over to the Population Health Exchange website at www.pophealthex.org, where you'll find BU's Hub for Lifelong Learning, all kinds of population health tools, programs, games, lotteries. I don't know. What else you find on there, Nick? Pachinko. When was the last time Pachinko came up in conversation? Pachinko is the game where the pins and you drop the
balls down
coin and they follow a normal distribution.
Yeah, it's been a while. Yeah. 1991, I suspect.
Wow. Don't know why 1991, but okay. Anyway, let's move on to the show. So today in our first segment, which is our Journal Club segment, we're going to look at a study on the impact of the HPV vaccine on cervical cancer rates in the UK. Just realizing now we're having a very UK-themed couple of weeks. Then in our second part of the podcast, which is our deep dive, we're going to talk about the dangers of meta-analysis using the Ivermectin story, which I just find to be the most depressing but also fascinating story.
It really is.
I mean, I suppose it's similar to the hydroxychloroquine in a lot of ways, but boy, the number of people that I see online who are devotees of Ivermectin.
I got one thing to say to you, man.
What?
Albendazole. It's coming.
Albendazole?
Oh, God.
Like, it's another anti-parasitic
you
drug.
think that's going to be the next?
Oh, man, like albendazole totally treats COVID.
Really?
I'm sure of it. Yeah, I've got every reason to believe that there's precedent.
I thought Rogaine was going to be the next.
Does that treat parasites?
No, I don't know.
We seem to be plumbing the anti-parasitic line pretty aggressively here.
And then in our third segment, which is our Amazing and Amusing, we'll get into some things that make us laugh out loud. So segment one, we're talking about an article on the impact of HPV vaccination on cervical cancer rates, published in The Lancet and entitled The Effects of the National HPV Vaccination Program in England, UK, on cervical cancer and grade 3 cervical intraepithelial neoplasia incidence, a registry-based observational study, thereby proving me wrong last week when I said that it was the longest title ever. So I guess the Lancet just has really long titles. I hadn't been paying much attention to that. But anyway, by first author, Dr. Milena Falcaro of the Cancer Prevention Group at the School of Cancer Pharmaceutical Sciences at my semi-alma mater, King's College of London. I went there for a year. Does that count?
Are you regal now?
I am.
Did you become king?
I don't want
upon graduation.
I don't want to brag on the air, so we won't talk about it. So here are some headlines for this one. Yahoo says vaccinating girls against HPV dramatically reduced cervical cancer rates in the UK. study finds. CBS News says HPV vaccines slash cervical cancer rates up to 87%. Study finds. And MSN says cervical cancer rates are down by 87% thanks to HPV vaccine. But will this proof that vaccines save lives sway anti-vaxxers?
No.
I totally agree with you.
Don't have to ask that question.
Clearly no.
It doesn't matter what it is.
And that is why they asked the question.
Even if they had like the vaccine that prevents death from all causes,
yep,
they're going to be opposed to it because of the side effects. Which is like life. Chief black box warning, vaccine prevents death.
May cause life.
May cause life.
Okay. Anyway, Chris, you wanna walk us through this one? I know that you found this one very simple and straightforward. So why don't you just
my goodness, simple and straightforward it was not.
Yeah, especially the analysis section. Would you go deeply into that one?
Yeah, line by line reading.
I'm going to ask Matt to explain some of the methods here because this was very complicated. This was a very complicated study, but it was a very good study, very powerful study. They, were basically trying to address the problem that has really bedeviled the cervical cancer, the HPV vaccines from the very beginning, which is that the evolution of cervical cancer takes 10 to 20 years. And so how do you prove that even though there's sort of these strong epidemiologic links between HPV and cervical intraepithelial neoplasia, which is like a precancerous lesion, and even though we have seen observationally that the precancerous lesions do tend to sort of build on each other and eventually will lead to cervical cancer. So the model of the evolution of the disease makes it very plausible that by intervening at the beginning, you could stave off the endpoint. But the fact remains that directly proving that HPV vaccines prevent cervical cancer has been hard to do because it takes 10 to 20 years after the introduction of the vaccines to see that effect. But now we have finally arrived at the bus station. Now the sufficient time has elapsed that we can actually start to do these analyses. And the results are increasingly definitive, I would say. So, 2 years ago, I think, on episode 18, I believe it was, of this very podcast.
Wow, good memory.
We looked at this Scottish study that they reference here as being an example of where the precancerous states, the CIN 2 or 3, were significantly reduced when this was introduced into Scotland. And we were very excited about that because it seemed like this was moving towards the final step. Now we have 2 studies, one in the New England Journal of Medicine last January, done in Sweden, and this study, both of which
3 years ago. No, was
it was
not?
three semesters ago. In fact, as I count them, that was this semester and last semester. So that sounds like 2 semesters.
There was a preprint.
I see.
This is an inside joke.
So now we have these 2 studies, and they are the thing that chiefly distinguishes the Sweden study from this study is that in Sweden it was Gardasil, which is then I think was a 4-valent vaccine, is now a 9-valent vaccine, but the differences are not all that important.
Valent meaning number
that
of
it covers
strains.
The different strains, right? So it's the 9 most important ones. But the truth is that 70% of cervical cancer is caused by 2 strains.
16 and 18.
So as long as you get 16 and 18, you've done most of the work. So whereas Cervarix focuses on 16 and 18. And the British used Cervarix, the Swedes used Gardasil. So other than that, the 2 analyses are quite similar because they're not randomized controlled trials because you can't do a 10-year randomized controlled trial. What you have to do is at the end of 10 years, once you sort of reach this point where, you're starting to see that the natural history of the disease is such that you might start to see effect, you do a massive database search to try to match up the apparent vaccination status of the cohort as they were 10, 15 years ago with cancer incidence now. So to do that, you need 2 things. One is you need to know what were the policies at the time in terms of the offering of these vaccines. And the second thing you need to know is what the cancer results, the diagnosis was. So for the latter one, which is a little bit easier, they use the British Cancer Registry. It's got a name. I don't know I can't remember. It doesn't matter. They have a comprehensive registry. The way that they sort of set up their analysis was somewhat clever, I thought, where they looked basically at 2 periods in time within which they were able to carve out different cohorts based on age. And what they were trying to do effectively was to say, we know that in theory, vaccines like Gardasil or Cervarix are going to work best if they're given to women, young girls, in fact, prior to the onset of sexual activity, because if you can prevent HPV infection in the first place, then that's the most effective way of preventing, CIN or cancer. And so but the way that the vaccine was actually introduced is that they started using this, I think in 2004, was it? And they initially offered it to girls who were 12 or 13 years old, and also did a catch-up campaign for older girls. And their hypothesis was that the effect would be strongest in the young girls and less pronounced in the older girls because you're not actually staving off HPV in the first place. And then they went to a slightly older cohort, basically repeating this experiment under the sort of the pseudo assumption that these girls would have been offered and would have received vaccine, even though the vaccine had not yet been introduced. And so by comparing these two sets of cohorts, you can draw some inferences about the number of CIN detections and the number of cervical cancers detected, as well as, working backwards, figure out what was the preventable burden of both of these two syndromes.
And could you just say what CIN is?
So CIN is the precancerous version of cervical cancer. It stands for cervical intraepithelial neoplasia, which is maybe, in the breast cancer parlance, we would call that like carcinoma in situ, which means like sort of an early, not particularly malignant version of this cancer that, if left unattended, may eventually evolve into the life-threatening proper cervical cancer. And CIN is graded into very mild, CIN1, to increasingly severe, up to CIN3, and after CIN3, it becomes cervical cancer. And so they were looking at these two sort of important outcomes, recognizing that CIN3 is very common, whereas cancer itself is about tenfold less common. And so that's the advantage in looking at both of these. And what they found was, the math behind this was, I have to say, extremely complicated. But there was a piece of this method that really resonated with me, and I want to actually sort of state this, which is that one of the challenges to studying the impact of a vaccine on cancer is that the behavior of vaccine uptake is so confounded by many things, like religious beliefs and sexuality and economics and education. And all of those things are obviously going to have an effect. So like comparing people who chose to have a vaccine from those who didn't choose to have a vaccine is fraught because the two populations are bound to be completely dissimilar. So that is true. But on the other hand, the process of offering a vaccine, which is what they are actually analyzing here, because in this study, they did not actually confirm that people had received the vaccine. They're only working under the assumption that they were offered the vaccine and had the opportunity to say yes. And the contrast with vaccine uptake versus vaccine offering is that those individual labile behavioral confounders don't apply because it's the system that we're now looking at rather than the individual who accepts it. And so taking that assumption as being a rather important caveat that they didn't have individual level vaccination status, they're only looking at these populations, they were then able to draw these inferences. And what they found in both cases was a really profound reduction in both the CIN and the cervical cancer incidence, and that, as predicted, the most benefit was achieved when the vaccinations were given earlier in life in the 12 and 13-year-old girls. So, combined with the Scotland study, the Sweden study, and now this British study, I think the evidence is becoming almost unimpeachable that these vaccines are highly effective at reducing cancer. And so this is powerful. But of course, it's not over because there are all sorts of sort of like secondary, I hate to use the word again, pragmatic questions. For example, there's a movement towards the use of a single dose of Gardasil and whether or Cervarix, as opposed to the 3-shot series as they're currently licensed, which would make the access to the vaccine globally far more practical. So I thought this was a great study. I was intrigued by it. I found the methodology to be bewildering and daunting, and I'm hoping you'll have something more sophisticated to say, Matt. But that's the gist of it.
I thought it
seems like it worked well.
I thought it was elegant and sophisticated.
There we go. Thank you, sir.
Just to be specific here, so there was about an 87% reduction in cancer incidence and a 97% reduction in CIN3. So a substantial reduction.
Really powerful.
The other thing I wanted to just read again is the title, which was The Effects of a National HPV Vaccination Program. So just getting to what you were pointing at, Chris, which is this is not the effect of the vaccine. It's the effect of the vaccination program.
It's more like an ecological study, really.
It is an ecological study. In fact, these are not, it's one of the comments I had, these are not individual level effects. These are population level effects, which comes with some potential challenges, but So as you say, the benefits here are that you don't have to deal with the individual level confounding, because people who take the vaccine and people who don't are going to be very different, and it's going to, maybe you can tease it out, but it's hard to do. But just evaluating the effects of the policy is not confounded in that way, but it is confounded potentially by any time trend. So if independent of the vaccine, HPV was just starting to disappear, that would be wrapped up with the policy. But it's hard to make the argument that HPV was declining to the point that we would have seen a 97% reduction or an 87% reduction in cancer independent of the vaccine. So the story holds together really well.
And I was thinking, because we often go through this exercise of saying, like, if there is bias, in which way would the bias go, right? And here you have to say, like, the people who are most likely to refuse the vaccine, I mean, I don't know what their risk of getting, exposed to HPV would be. Maybe it's much lower. I don't know. I truly have no idea which direction that goes. But if we said, for example, that those who are most likely to refuse the vaccine are the ones who are most likely to be exposed to the virus, let's take the worst case scenario, then these results are conservative.
Oh, I would agree. I mean, I think we'll get into it. It's because I think there are a number of ways this could go. A number of issues that come up that are minor, but could come up. But I agree with you on that one. I think you're absolutely right. Don, your take on this study? Did you love it as much as Chris did, and did you read the methods section over and over and over?
Yes,
very clear methods section.
Yes,
lovingly.
Yes, and yes. Yeah, no, I thought that this is the third in a triumvirate of really important studies, and we can eradicate cervical cancer probably from the face of the earth. It'll take a huge effort, but I mean, we now have the tools, and this is one of the most amazing tools. One of the most efficacious vaccines, just in terms of getting rid of HPV, not much less CIN or cancer. I thought it was sort of interesting the way it's in the method section. I didn't dive too deeply, but I thought it was kind of cool the way they dealt with two different scenarios that would affect ascertainment of cases. And one was that when apparently in England, there is a first cervical examination in girls at around, I think, the age of 13 or 14. And so there's a systematic surveillance for cervical pathology. And they had to account for there being an excess number of cases that would be found during that period of time, because those particular girls, whether they've been sexually active or not, had some period of time to actually be exposed and develop cancer. So they had to adjust for that. And then the other thing that they had to adjust for was what they call the Jane Goody effect.
Yeah,
that was very interesting.
Really, really interesting.
Yeah.
And apparently there was this young woman who became an internet star. She became very, very famous in Britain because she was on a series of those reality TV shows. And she was very, very controversial and really made a name for herself that was both positive and negative. But she came down with cervical cancer and died rather quickly at the age of 27. And because of the visibility of that particular issue, there presumably were secular trends in how many women went and had screening.
Yeah. The screening rates went way up.
Yeah, as you would expect. And they had to account for that because this was an evaluation of a program, not an evaluation of individuals. The last thing I wanted to say is that it's even more important because we're now seeing an absolute epidemic of head and neck cancer in young men or middle-aged men. And that goes along. That's also due to HPV. It's also due to serotypes 16 and 18, as well as penile cancer and anal cancer. So it's not just cervical cancer that we need to focus this on. So we need to also expand from women to men.
Absolutely.
Or girls to boys, because not only are you going to get yet unproven, but very likely beneficial effect in terms of head and neck cancer and penile cancer and anal cancer, but you're going to get more bang for your buck because you're going to get herd immunity.
Mm-hmm.
You're going to achieve herd immunity much more readily if the entire population is immunized to HPV than if it's just the female part of the population. Mm. So I this is a great study.
Totally agree. You brought up the issue of herd immunity. So they did these calculations to try and say, okay, based on what we know about the effectiveness of the vaccine and the the uptake of the vaccine over time, what are we going to expect that we're going to see in terms of benefits? And the benefits that they anticipated were in the range of, say, 60 to 70%, with lower depending on the year of the cohort. So what they anticipated was lower than what they actually observed. They observed an even larger effect. Now, some of that could be some amount of bias. I mean, there probably is some in here. But I also wonder, do you think this is, their simple calculation wouldn't have accounted for herd immunity? And I do wonder whether some of that is you're not only seeing the benefit to the individual, but you're seeing the benefit to all of those people that this is not being passed on to from the onward transmission. So I'm not sure if that's what's going on, but it seemed to me plausible.
I want to extend that because the issue of herd effect, like to say, Matt Fox is vaccinated and therefore Matt Fox does not infect Christopher Gill or Dorothea. So the classic example of herd immunity. But there's another way of looking at this too, which is like, what is the conjoint probability of my getting infected if you are vaccinated and I am vaccinated and we are interacting? So that there's the randomized controlled trials done by Pfizer or Moderna or any of these large trials cannot answer that question. They're only looking at what happens to Matt if Matt is vaccinated, but not like what happens if a network of people are vaccinated, where you would in fact imagine that the effect of the vaccine would be even higher, distinct even from herd effects. So I think that, and now I'm just like, the more we talk about this trial and the complexity of this trial, the more sort of my hat's off to these people for figuring out a way to go back and come up with a really rigorous approach to measuring ultimate impact in terms of cancer from an event that occurred 10 to 15 years ago. That is so difficult to do. So, bravo. I
would agree. So the one, I wanted to go back to the issue that you raised, Chris, which is the issue of whether the potential biases in here would be quote unquote conservative or not. And I think the one you raised would certainly be conservative if we define conservative as meaning the effects would in fact even be greater if you accounted for it. The one that I do wonder a little bit about is under registration in the later cohorts. And the reason I say that is, and this is just based on my experience, this has nothing to do with the UK data or this particular issue, but I have just found every analysis that I have ever done in cohorts using data that's sort of routinely collected, like, these would be, data appears later than you expect it to. So you think, the year is up and you've got all the data on all the cervical cancer cases that happened in that year. And then you go download the data again a year later and you find there were more cases in the year before than you had previously. And it's coding issues, it's getting the things. So it is plausible to me that they missed some of the cervical cancer cases in those very late cohorts. But again, not enough that I would be concerned about something, changing these results dramatically. But it is just sort of one of those things that, I don't know, you're nodding, Chris, so I'm guessing you've had this experience as well.
Well, yeah, we just published a set of papers about COVID-19 incidents in different populations. And we'd written the two companion papers were published ahead of the main effects paper. And the numbers don't quite add up. And it's exactly this phenomenon that the things sort of trickle in at the end. And when you finally get to the tallying, you're like, you're off by a little bit.
Yeah, so. and sometimes it's you're off by a reasonable amount. Like in your case, it was it's probably just data collection and timing. But with this sort of registry-based stuff, I mean, I'm sure it's pretty regimented and it works really well. And at the same time, like I look at the COVID data, and you look at these COVID websites, and all the time they are revising the data back in time. And so these sort of things happen, and I suspect there's some of that going on here as well.
It's like the unemployment statistics.
Exactly. Yes, that's what I was thinking.
Yeah.
Why do they do that thing where before the day that they're going to release these reports, they interview a whole bunch of, quote, experts about what they say the reports are going to say? Right. And they're usually completely wrong. And they never go back and say, we reported at 9 a.m. that we're going to have 600,000 jobs and we only had 200,000 jobs. And now there's like egg on faces all across the macroeconomics community. They never go back and point out that the experts were completely wrong. But they ask them again next time.
But they also revise last month and the month before and the month before. So they're constantly revising them.
So it turns out actually the experts were right, even though the report was wrong.
Who knows?
Either way, the whole thing seems wackadoodle to me.
Yeah.
So the other thing I think that is worth noting is these effects are huge. They do have moderately wide confidence intervals around them, but these are big effects. And these are early effects. I mean, this is not lifelong. This is the 10-year, I think, roughly effect.
Right. We haven't seen nothing yet.
There's still more benefit probably to be gained.
Or not.
Or not? Go ahead. Say more about that.
I mean, it could be that the benefit is most pronounced in the beginning, and with waning immunity, like we're seeing with COVID, it could potentially wear off. And, if you could be protected in your teens and early 20s, and if the immunity wanes and you're not boosted, we have no idea what the immunology on this thing is over time, you get exposed in your 20s or 30s, you might develop cervical cancer in your 40s or 50s.
Yeah, it's a good point. I suppose that's true. I guess I was assuming that probably most of the transmission is happening earlier, that there is still obviously transmission happening in the 30s, let's say, and 40s, but most of it's happening in the late teens and 20s. And therefore, those who are going to, from the, who didn't get the vaccine in their, teens, may go on to develop cervical cancer later on into their 40s and maybe even in their 50s, and we're not picking those up yet because we just haven't followed those women long enough. But I take your point.
I mean, we really don't know about the immunology. It could be that you get infected early on during your teen years, and if you were sexually abstinent for 15 or 20 years, like with malaria, your immunity could wane, and then you could get infected again, and that may be an issue. Or it could be that constant reinfection is required to maintain a level of immunity that isn't the same as with a vaccine. So we don't know.
Good point.
This is really important preliminary data, but this story needs to be told over the course of the next 20 or 30 years. Too.
Absolutely.
Yep.
Well, among the many so-called facts that are bouncing in my mind from medical school 20 years ago was this statement by, I think probably an obstetrician in second-year medical school, that the vulnerability of the cervix is age-dependent, that there's a maturation of the squamous epithelial line that becomes more resilient in terms of protecting the individual against or being resistant to HPV as the girls mature. And so it may be that this is a counterfact, that perhaps what you're describing as being, this could be sort of like a reason why HPV vaccines are less effective over time, because of this, loss of immunity over time that might occur with these vaccines. And actually, I have no idea if that's true, but it could be true.
There's still lots to be learned about
versus,
this.
Maybe it's all about the timing, that you really want to get to these protect these girls when that the cervix is anatomically most at risk. But that again is, I have to say, that is a distant echo of neurons in my brain there.
Fair enough. All right, any last thoughts before we move on?
Yeah,
Don, you got one.
I just looked this up, and it turns out that the UK has, beginning in 2019, has offered this vaccine to boys.
I think that's such a smart idea.
Which is a great idea, and it's great that they finally came around to doing that, and hopefully there's going to be a lot of uptake, because we know that the UK has a lot of vaccine hesitancy. But that also means that the data that we just described was not confounded by herd immunity from the boys. Indirect immunity from the boys.
Yep.
So this was a pure, girl, woman effect.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Absolutely. Very cool. All right, let's move on to our second segment, where we're going to talk about an article, more of a letter, I guess, but it's a short article in...
And the letter is I. For
the letter
Ivermectin.
is definitely I for
stands
Ivermectin.
for Ivermectin.
So it was in Nature. It was a letter to the editor called "The Lesson of Ivermectin, Meta-analysis based on summary data alone are inherently unreliable," by Jack Clark, Gideon Meyerowitz Katz, James Heatherts, Nick Brown, and Kyle Sheldrick. And I don't know if you know these folks, but these are some of the folks who have been doing a lot of the work on debunking a lot of the stuff around ivermectin, but also doing a lot of the identifying data fraud and things like that. So they've got a real reputation for doing fantastic work, but also that comes along with it, a lot of attacks against them because they're identifying fraud. People who are big fans of ivermectin are pretty upset about that. Now, we can get into the main issue of the article, which is they are essentially saying that they're setting up the case that there were these studies done, quote unquote, trials of ivermectin as a treatment or a prevention, for COVID. Prevention or treatment or both?
I think both.
Yeah.
I think people are using it for both.
Yeah, and showed a strong benefit. And then over time, it has come out that most of the studies that found a benefit were
cooked.
In fact, fraudulent studies. And they were, these folks identified some of these, and some of them just came to light through other means. And so they're making the case that part of the reason why we weren't able to identify this so quickly is that meta-analyses are based on trusting what is in the published literature, not actually reviewing the individual patient level data. And so they're making the argument that unless we do individual patient level meta-analysis, we are always going to be vulnerable to this. So we could talk about that if you want to, but I'm more interested in the bigger picture here, which is, I mean, were we just set up for failure here? I mean, we went from hydroxychloroquine to, I forget what the second one was, to ivermectin. We keep bouncing through these various, supposedly wonder drugs, of which the research that undergirds them, to the extent that anyone ever believed it in the first place, often turns out to be fraudulent.
Or just poorly
executed. In some cases,
like that French study that touted hydroxychloroquine.
Exactly.
Turned out to be a terrible study.
In some cases, it's just bad research. Is this a case where if we were not in an emergency situation, if this was not a global pandemic, we wouldn't have such a setup for people wanting to commit fraud to generate evidence for something, evidence in air quotes, and we would have picked it up? Or do you think there are every drug that's out there has got at least a few studies in the meta-analysis that are fraudulent? I don't think that's the case. I think this is specific to what we're going through now. And
exactly.
That is so politicized that this is how it happens.
Politicized enough that people want to commit fraud.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Bizarre as well.
The thing that just I completely don't understand, I completely don't get, it has to do with the political nature of this, and that is that those individuals who are casting aspersions at good science are using bad science, but citing it as good science to advance their anti-science agenda. I mean, it just makes no sense at all.
That's because you're presuming that they're acting in good faith, Tom.
Well, that's what I'm saying. I'm saying that this is really political, but the logic is just so faulty. I completely don't understand it. It's sort of like the West LA vegan housewives who absolutely are anti-vaxxers because it's not natural and they don't believe the science, but they absolutely subscribe to the science of global climate change. How can one set of science be correct and the other set of science is incorrect just because it's convenient to what your preconceptions are and what your value system is? Mm-hmm. It's to me the thing that is the most distressing is that we are living in this convenient anti-science era. I was a Sputnik baby, and to me, science was a religion. It was the truth, and it was faulty and it was not perfect, but it was as close to the truth as we were going to ever get, and people don't believe that anymore, and I just don't understand it. It just kills me.
Mm-hmm. So, do you think that we have set ourselves up for this, though? I mean, the movement. I mean, we are here every 2 weeks looking at studies, many of which are great studies and many of which we look at and they're not so great. And we feel like it's our role to be honest about that, right?
And we had a podcast about this where we were trying to fall on our swords and say, are we part of the problem?
And so I just wonder, if we set up a system that is really vulnerable to this kind of stuff, that the peer review process is not designed to catch fraud. I don't look through studies looking for evidence of fraud. I go into it assuming that everything is, it might not be high quality, but that it is in good faith. And, our systems just aren't designed to pick this up. And so we are incredibly vulnerable to the trends that you're talking about now, where there are vested interests in using science, quote unquote science, against us. And I share exactly what you just described at the beginning, which is that the number of people that I see on Facebook or wherever who are what I would say really twisting science, really cherry picking, and really using the language of science by saying other people are cherry picking and, you have no data to support your claim. And, here's evidence. And then they'll show you evidence that is just a simple time trend or a correlation, while simultaneously telling you that your randomized trial isn't evidence because you don't have, you did a vaccine study, but you didn't get antibody titers on everybody at the end to know that they were actually protected. it's like there is a co-opting of scientific dialogue against science that is really frustrating. Chris?
Yes, and it's catering to the people who are actually not particularly familiar with the scientific method, who are going to be persuaded because it sounds very impressive.
Exactly.
I mean, there are a couple other aspects of this that I thought were really interesting. One of them was that in the two meta-analyses that they reference, the first of which was published in the American Journal of Therapeutics as an e-publication only, and that paper included a bunch of studies which were basically a wash showing that ivermectin didn't work, and was dominated by one paper that showed an outstanding benefit. And that paper had only been released in preprint and was later retracted by the preprint server because it appeared to be fraudulent. And so here we have a meta-analysis where we're not even pretending to adhere to good practices in terms of quality selection in studies. I mean, when did you ever see a preprint go as the driving force behind a meta-analysis? And the fact is that it came out in a third-tier journal that nobody would otherwise read, except in today's hyper-politicized world where people are looking for exactly this kind of evidence that they can cite as being their scientific basis for saying that ivermectin is the way to go. It's really interesting.
Yeah, but one thing I would point out is, and I don't remember specifically what they're referencing there, but one of the big meta-analyses, and they referred to this, reanalyzed their data after the fraudulent studies were pulled and changed their conclusions, and they did the right thing. But I agree with you that those early meta-analyses were very influential, and it's hard to you can't put the genie back in the bottle.
That's right. The other thing that I find so ironic about this constant quest for an alternative to vaccines, where we're so afraid of vaccines because of the uncertain long-term side effects of these vaccines, which is such a frustrating argument because, if you say, well, I don't trust a vaccine until we have 10 years of safety data, then, well, I guess we got to wait 10 years for the safety data, and there's no shortcut there, right?
Nope.
There's no meta-analysis you can do on that one, unless it's the Journal of Time Travel.
Oh, I like that one.
I mean, maybe we should start that. But anyway, the passion behind ivermectin or azithromycin or hydroxychloroquine is so outside the plausible magnitude of these drugs, which, as far as we can tell, really have no benefit. And at the same time, there's a complete absence of agitation or advocacy. In fact, it's the crickets are chirping around the very effective drugs recently being licensed by Merck and Pfizer that reduce mortality by 90%, actually work. And no one is saying a thing about that.
But they're making a huge amount of money off of it. You're not hearing about ivermectin because they can't make money off of it. That is what you see.
I mean, Merck is definitely not into making money on ivermectin, but of course they want to make money off of COVID drugs.
I know.
Do you think that this whole thing is being driven by the anti-vaxxers?
I do.
Yes, I'm afraid I
do. I mean, I think there have been studies that most of the vaccine misinformation propagates from a very limited
12 people.
Very limited number of sources.
17.
And they are making money off of selling, supplements and all sorts of
Prevagen.
But
they're all selling Prevagen, Don.
But why? Oh, please don't get me started. But what?
They're not selling Prevagen.
I mean, I don't.
Don hates Prevagen.
What I don't understand is why this this thing has become a rallying point for a whole host of non-virulent anti-vaxxers. The whole Republican Party just about has taken this up. And, whether it's hydroxychloroquine or whether it's azithromycin or whether it's ivermectin, it's not just those 17 people or it's not just the wackadoodle anti-vaxxers. It's a huge segment of the population. I can understand it with all of the acts that are happening now to undermine democracy, because I understand what the secondary gain to undermine democracy is for the Republican Party at this point. I don't understand what the secondary gain for the Republican Party or all of those non-pure anti-vaxxers are for embracing this stuff.
It's another cultural wedge issue.
That is undermining science.
Yeah.
Undermining.
It's going to backfire. I mean,
eventually
I hope so.
It doesn't work. This doesn't last.
I don't mean for them. I mean for humanity.
Yeah. It's are they trying to undermine the laws of physics? Are they trying to convince Elon Musk that rocket ship's not going to go up in the air?
Maybe that's where this is all headed. Yeah. All right. Well, you can see we are
passionate.
We're passionate. We're also, I would say I'm a little distraught on this one. This one really, really worries me. So let's get out of the funk and move on to the last segment, which is the amazing and amusing. Chris, what do you got?
I'm going to talk about making biscuits because we're coming up to Thanksgiving.
Oh, what kind of biscuits are we talking?
I'm really talking about cats when they need.
What?
It's like British Bake Off?
If you've ever had a cat,
yes,
no.
Many cats do this behavior where they knead. It's like they're kneading the bread.
Yeah.
They kind of go and they get really into it. And they purr like crazy, and they just go into a trance and they knead the biscuits. And the British call it making the biscuits, and we call it kneading bread. But the cats probably call it something else. I don't know what it is. But my cat does this all the time, and
you really are
charming.
not talking about biscuits. You're talking about cats.
Cats making the biscuits.
I really thought we were talking about actual biscuits.
Well, I suppose if the biscuit dough was soft and furry and comforting, the cats could actually knead the biscuits.
Okay.
But what I was curious about is why do they do this?
Why do they do this?
Well, I investigated, and I came up with a series of theories. One is that they are recreating the behavior of making their bed in the wild, where they would like go into a grassy area, and then they would sort of trample the grass down so they can make a little nest to sleep in.
Like dogs going in a circle before they lie down.
Yeah, like that.
Why
like
do dogs
sort
go in
of
a circle?
creating the bedding space.
The dogs, before they lie down, they usually go in a circle.
Why?
Same reason.
They're making their bed. They're finding
Tamping down the grass.
They're
Really?
making themselves
Is that
safe.
why? I didn't know that.
And there's some evidence to back this up, because it turns out that like people who have grassy backyards where they don't mow the lawn very often and have cats, that the cats do actually go out into the lawn and trample down little circular areas and sleep in them. Oh. So there's some theory to that. So I thought, that's okay. So that's one theory. The other one is that perhaps the cats are remembering in some sort of deep way the behavior to express milk from their mothers. Mm-hmm. That they kind of need the abdomen of the mom, and then it creates the milk letdown reflex. And there's some evidence to suggest that too, because little kittens do this to their mothers. And it does release the milk as you would expect. And when the cats do this making the biscuits thing, if they're sitting on a blanket, they will often suck on the blanket after they do this. Huh. So it's kind of like they're remembering the whole process of bonding with their mother. And I find that at the same time charming and sad, because it's charming because it's obviously a powerful, friendly, happy emotion for the cat that they're remembering. And it's sad because they're away from their mummies. And that makes me just so want to cry. So that's the second theory. The third one is kind of linked to that. It is that the cats are trying to, because they often need the biscuits on your lap, which is, if you have a cat, this is painful, right? Because you don't want to stop the cat from doing it, because they're just in ecstasy, but they're digging their claws into your thighs as they need the biscuits on your leg, and it hurts. But the theory is that perhaps this is creating a maternal bond with their owner, and that this is part of the sort of like replacement of the actual mother with the new mother. Interesting theories. A more mundane explanation is that they just like it because it's soft and it relaxes them, and they just kind of, it feels good. And there's a certain, obviously, that's true, because my cat, when he does this, tends to prefer to do this in the sun on a very fluffy pillow. So it feels good. And the fifth one is that cats, believe it or not, have scent glands in their hands.
Really?
And so part of it is believed that they might be marking their territory by sort of putting their fingerprints all over the thing that they find so comfortable that they want to own. And one veterinarian who was interviewed on this said that she thinks that this has got a lot to do with kittenhood. And she says that only about 1 in 100 adult cats will need the biscuits, as opposed to kittens, who pretty much universally do this. However, in my personal sample of 5 cats in my lifetime, Oedipus, Cato, Max, Hercules, and Jackson, named after your son.
Oh, come on.
100% of those cats needed the biscuits, made the biscuits all the way through their lives.
Really?
Yeah.
Maybe it's just because of the insecurity that they feel in the environment that they're living in.
Probably, because they're not afraid of me. That is for sure. My cat is the most sort of like bold and uninhibited creature you've ever met. His best friend, by the way, is the golden retriever, Moose. Moose was a puppy, and Jackson already owned the house. And after Jackson, got over his shock and horror at a dog being introduced into his territory, and finally came downstairs after about 2 weeks, they became best friends. And every single day, they play this game of aggressive wrestling, where the dog, who's like 70 pounds, and the cat who's like 5 pounds, go at it, full bore wrestling, rolling around on the circles, batting each other, but never actually hurting each other. One day, the cat got his claws hooked on the dog's lower eyelid. Ooh. And the dog just sort of paused in the middle of mid-wrestle, right? And then the cat paused, and they both kind of sat down with the claws still hooked into the dog's face. And the cat then gently pulled his claws away and then licked the dog's face.
Aww.
So sorry, I didn't mean to hurt you.
That's so sweet.
It was just charming.
Huh.
Okay, so we need to have a very, very long discussion about how this all came about, this whole piece you just did there. You sat down today at some point last night, and you just thought, I'm going to figure out why cats
make the biscuits.
That is... Are you written up in any textbooks anywhere? There has got to be a case study.
Normal psychology.
There's an ICD-9 code to go.
A case study that is Chris Gill. Wow. Well, you set up mine perfectly because I am doing the same thing I did last time, which is, as I said, I love when people commit to a bit, when academics commit to a bit. And this is a tweet that was sent out by Severine Lamont. And the tweet says, when your mentee at Patrick Owen, PhD, loses the plot and makes your lockdown day, this paper is going to be highly cited. And she then includes the paper that he made.
Are Cats Good?
Which is entitled, Are Cats Good? An Important Study. And I'm going to read you the study. Introduction. A cat is a four-legged creature. Purring is odd, but most people could just deal with it. Asking too many questions regarding purring is not recommended. No studies have examined if cats are good. Therefore, the aim of the current study was to determine if cats inherently are good. Methods. This was a consensus opinion study between two scientists. Both were asked if cats were good. If consensus was not achieved, a series of egg and spoon races were held each Sunday morning until opinions aligned. Sensitivity analysis are a good idea, but beyond the scope of this paper. Results. Collectively, 100% of opinions suggested that cats were good.
I love it.
No egg and spoon races were held. I just love it when, people commit to the bit.
Comes to a definitive solution at last.
They did, and it follows on perfectly from your
I love it.
cat musings, which really we're going to have to talk about in detail when this is over.
Fair enough.
All right. Well, that is the end of our program. If you've got any feedback on this or any other episode, or you have a study that you want us to take on, you can tweet us at @PopHealthEX or tweet me at Prof. Matt Fox or Don at DTheo1 or Chris at ID.Gill. Or you can find us on the Population Health Exchange website at www.pophealthex.org. We want to thank Leslie Talalian, the Assistant Dean of Lifelong Learning at the BU School of Public Health, for supporting the podcast, and Nick Guler for sound editing. And Nick, I wanted your feedback because you have cats. Is he on the right? Which theory do you think is the most likely of Chris's? Oh, you think cats are good? Yeah, you have cats. We've seen your cats. Or cat? One cat. Anyway, thanks for joining us. We hope you enjoyed it, and we hope you will download our next episode.